summary of the discussion is available within the knowledge circles under Rural Women's Unpaid Care Work, and you have the full summary there. We had some very interesting recommendations and comments with our participant pointing out that there isn't enough interest among policymakers on this issue, and other pointing out that unpaid care work is a resource that is utilized within the whole society but still not considered in economic policymaking. So we want to bring high-level attention to this issue and continue on the Knowledge Gateway to talk about it, to share our resources, and continue. Today, we have an opportunity to engage directly with experts on unpaid care work, and it's also an opportunity for all of you to share your ideas and feedback into ongoing work on this issue with these experts, as well as the Knowledge Gateway community. As I mentioned before, if you have any comments or feedback in terms of the presentation, please send it in the chat box. If you have problems with the technology itself, you can also contact us by email, knowledge.gateway@unwomen.org. And if you would like to speak and not send your comment in the box, you can also raise the hand sign, and we will then unmute your microphone once it's your turn to speak. And we would also encourage you all to make sure that your audio is working and that you're using your computer headset or your phone connection. And if you have some trouble to hear us or to be heard once we give you the opportunity to speak, the first thing to do would be to close other applications on your computer, which definitely will improve the speed of your connection. And again, you have here our email address, knowledge.gateway@unwomen.org, for anything that you would like to raise. We would like to also run some polls with you on this issue of unpaid care work. And here we want to just do a practice poll, and we are launching it right now. And you have the opportunity here to just make sure that for the other polls that we'll be running with you later, that you answer which household task do you most like to do. A, cooking, and in some countries that includes getting water and fuel. B, washing or ironing clothes. C, cleaning the house. D, food shopping or growing the food. E, care of children, elderly, or the sick. And we are getting some answers. I think I will let it for a little bit. And while we see your responses to this first test and practice poll, I would like to introduce the experts today. It's myself, Anna Felt. I'm going to moderate the discussion. I'm the moderator of the manager of the Knowledge Gateway. And we have the three experts today. Is Talia Kidder, who is the Senior Advisor for Women's Economic Rights at Oxfam. We have Rachel Musi from, she is the Women Economic Rights Coordinator at ActionAid. And we have Deepta Chopra, who is a research fellow at the Institute of Development Studies. And the initial responses that we have from the poll is it seems that the majority prefers cooking, 33%, and we are still getting responses, so it's changing slightly, but cooking is at the top, 32%, care of children, elderly and sick, 28%, cleaning the house, 21%, and then we had food, shopping, and growing food, and last comes washing and ironing clothes. So thank you so much for contributing to this poll, which was a practice for the two other polls that we will have later on today. And we are ready to get started. So Talia, I leave it to you to introduce the agenda of today's webinar.
Thank you. This is Thalia Kidder, and if I could have the agenda slide, please. The agenda for today has two sections. The first section is covering some definitions and framework and research to give us all a common ground to talk together. These aren't the only definitions and frameworks that exist. Some of you may have others, but our idea is to clarify at least the terms that we are using today, as our central focus is really to look at how we inspire action by ourselves and others to recognize and reduce and redistribute unpaid care work for rural women. So in the second section, we're going to be giving some examples of how our three organizations have worked with communities, with advocacy, and with communications to inspire action. And then we'll have time for discussion. So please do use the chat box on your right to write in your comments and questions throughout the whole webinar, so that by the end of the webinar or the end of the presentations, we'll have a number of questions that the organizers can put up for discussion, and your comments are welcome also. So over to Deepta for the next slide.
Great, thanks very much, Thalia. This is Deepta Chopra here, and I'm just going to take you through a few slides about what care is and what we are grappling with in this field. So basically, as Thalia explained, this is not just one definition, but there's no mutually accepted definition worldwide about care, except that it includes a range of things, and it includes both direct care of people, but also indirect care, because sometimes you go and fetch water, or you go and buy food and you clean because you need to take care of, because that affects the people that you're taking care of. It also includes volunteering in terms of community care of people, but also includes paid carers, cleaners, health and education workers. For us, we envisage care as a social good, which underpins all development progress. By saying that it's a social good, what I mean to say is that it sustains and reproduces society, and on which markets actually depend for their functioning. Now, there's a difference between what care is and what we are saying is unpaid care work, which is specifically important for rural women. And the three words that you see on your screen there is basically unpaid care work, and the unpaid is really, it's a distinguishing characteristic which distinguishes it from paid care work. It's not a policy ask. So it's not that we are saying it should be paid care, so rural women should be paid for doing their work, but it's basically a distinguishing element from the larger body of what care is, which is about paid care, cleaners, health and education workers, as I said earlier. The other important element of this is really about work, because this is recognition that this is not just something that women do out of love or out of the goodness of their hearts, which of course is also true, but a recognition that it takes time and energy to do this work. Could you have the next slide, please? Okay, so in terms of why unpaid care work is important is because, well, firstly, let me just say that, as we said, that care has a widespread, long-term and positive impact on well-being and development, and it is very critical for us to understand that care is important to address inequality and vulnerability, but that unpaid care work is also important in understanding how women, especially rural women, but also urban women, live their lives. Unpaid care work occupies large amounts of women and girls' time. It leads to time poverty, which impacts directly on the rights that women and girls can enjoy. Secondly, unpaid care work often leads to a lack of leisure time, which reduces women and girls' well-being, as well as negatively impacting on their health. And it's this drudgery of like the daily grind and very hard work, which leads to these adverse health outcomes. Unpaid care work is also important to understand because women in the paid labor market may not be able to provide for adequate substitutes for their care responsibilities, and this then compromises the human development outcomes for those that they are caring for. At the same time, any substitutes that may come through pushing the care responsibilities to older women and girls, which impacts on their development and rights, which means that this income actually is eroded with the cost of care substitution, but also that the empowerment that we're aiming to becomes individualized, limited, and unsustainable. Limited because women may drop out or fail to take full advantage of opportunities available, individualized rather than shared, especially if older women and girls replace mothers in the care of small children, and unsustainable because poor quality care is likely to have lasting adverse impacts on cognitive, educational, and therefore economic prospects also of the next generation. And also, who cares when women are working in paid jobs? As we said, it can lead to a reduction of care, and it can be eroded by payments as well for substitute care, which defeats the objective of women's empowerment. Next slide. Okay, so the care itself, and unpaid care work itself, is not a problem. It is positive. It underpins all development. It's really important. The problem is twofold. One, that it's unequal, because and the fact is that it's unequal between men and women, which then undermines women's and girls' rights. It limits their opportunities, as I've explained in the earlier slide. It limits their capabilities and choices, and therefore impedes their overall empowerment. The other important, interesting thing is that it's actually also invisible. And despite it being so important, it's almost like nobody can see it. So it's important, and we did some research at IDS which actually showed that it was invisible at multiple levels. It was invisible in policy in terms of the intent and implementation. It was invisible in research. So people who do research, people who commission research, don't really think about the impact that care is having, or the impact that the programs are having on care. It was also found, we also found care to be invisible in programming in terms of what the entry points could be, and how care could be integrated or mainstreamed, both in terms of the programs that focused on women, but also generally development programs. It's quite invisible. And of course, it's invisible amongst donors, government officials, and researchers. And ultimately, it doesn't have adequate investment, so therefore it's also invisible in budgeting. And these range of invisibilities play out in very critical ways to the detriment of women and girls' empowerment and well-being. So just to say a little bit more about the research, and could I have the next slide, please? We actually reviewed, we said, okay, we're going to look at all social protection and early childhood development policies. We chose these two sectors to see whether care was invisible or not, and where was care visible, whether we could make some linkages about why it was visible and what kinds of things would bring it to the fore. And we actually found, and this is also the empirical evidence behind the fact that when I say care is invisible, what does that mean? Well, we found that amongst all social protection policies, only 21% had an intent about care. So we reviewed 107 policies, out of which 23 policies did not say anything about care. And what was also interesting was the concentration of these social protection policies, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. And in the early childhood development policies, the ratio was even lower. You would expect that because it's about childcare, people would actually think about the carers as well. But actually, it was even lower because it was only 15%, so 41 out of 270 policies. And again, it was a concentration. This time, Latin America had a bit more. There were 33 countries from which these policies were chosen, and most of them were in Latin America and some in Sub-Saharan Africa. The other interesting thing that we found was that the main focus in social protection policies was on redistribution of care responsibilities from the family to the state. But there was nothing about men doing more work. There was nothing, only two actually, about how to reduce the drudgery. And in the early childhood development policy, actually the focus was quite reverse. It was about support for carers. There was a lot of policies which talked about the inclusion of men as fathers, and we thought that was really positive. There was also the redistribution to the state, mainly based on recognition of women working outside the home. So it was like as a response of women having to go outside the house to work that these policies had incorporated childcare centers at the workplace and things like that. But again, there was no policy which even recognized that care is hard work, that women have to work really hard, and that there's a lot of drudgery associated with it. These are just some very quick highlights, and if you would like to know more about the research, I've given the link below, and you could click on it after this webinar and see the report. But over to Rachel now, who will explain and go from it now. Rachel?
Hi everyone. My name is Rachel Messier and I'm coming from ActionAid. I'm going to talk a little bit about how we link care to human rights and women's rights. And particularly I want to make use and talk a little bit about the UN Special Rapporteur's report on extreme poverty and human rights, which was the basis for the e-discussion as well. The report came out in September and was officially presented to the UN General Assembly on the 23rd of October. And though many UN agencies, including UN Women, have discussed the issue of unpaid care work, this report is important because of a few key issues. First, it links unpaid care work, poverty, and human rights as the main theme for the report. And it directly makes it about women's rights. So the focus of the report is around women and girls' disproportionate responsibility for unpaid care work and the resulting human rights violations. A second important outcome of this report is that it places the responsibility for change onto governments, so that the state is seen as the main and primary duty bearer. And the presentation of this report to the UN General Assembly, but also at the Human Rights Council later on next year, will be an opportunity for national governments to debate this issue, so that it's not just seen as something about changing behaviors or norms within the home, but that it is also something that social policy and government have a role to play.
Rachel, there is some issues. Some participant can't really hear you. Can you speak up or increase the volume of your microphone?
Can you hear me better now?
Much better. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm just going to read out the statement that you see in front of you that says that across the world, millions of women still find that poverty is their reward for a lifetime spent caring, and unpaid care provision by women and girls is still treated as an infinite, cost-free resource that fills the gaps when public services are not available or accessible. The report calls for a fundamental shift in the status quo as part of states' fundamental human rights obligations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the rights violations and also the obligations of states in following up on this report. Can I get the next slide, please? So the report has a very specific focus on a few rights. I'm sure that you will have rights violations that you would add to this.
Rachel, sorry for interrupting again. Can you pull the microphone away from your mouth a little bit? Because it makes a little bit... Can I hear?
Is that better?
Yes, I think so. If those who have made some remarks in the comment box, if you could also give some feedback if it's better at this point. No, it seems to be fine. Just keep a distance, but with the microphone.
Okay, all right.
Thanks.
So the report mentions the following rights violations: the right to work, which relates to not being able to access paid employment; the rights at work, which looks at policies such as access to decent work, so equal wages, decent working conditions. It also looks at the right to education. The right to education is something that we've seen has come up in lots of the work that we've been doing at ActionAid around girls' education and girls not being able to continue their education as a result of the unpaid care work that they're expected to do at home to help out their mothers when their mothers may be seeking out paid work. Right to health was also listed in terms of the arduousness of some of this unpaid care work and the fact that it means that women may not have time to access healthcare services. A right to Social Security around Social Security benefits, maternity leave also were talked about, and the right to benefit from scientific progress. And here the report mainly talks about infrastructure and the fact that there has been great leaps and bounds in terms of road constructions, access to water, electricity, and yet many women in rural areas do not have access to these services, to these basic amenities, and as a result have to complement that have to fill the gap with their own unpaid care work. And finally, it's the right to participation, which is the right to be politically active. What we've seen in some of the areas that we work in, both urban and rural areas, is that women do not have the time to participate in a community meeting, especially if it's an hour before mealtime when they have to be preparing their meals. So we see that political participation of women is very much affected by their responsibility for unpaid care work. Can I get the next slide? I'm going to now talk a little bit about what are the human rights violations that we see due to women's and girls' unequal. Sorry, there's a mistake on the slide. This question is trying to link what are the human rights violations that we're seeing and how does this link to economic policy. And here we have to pay homage to the many feminist economists that have contributed to this debate already. And for many, many years, for over 3 decades now, feminist economists have highlighted how economic policies take advantage of women's unpaid care work to cushion the blow of austerity measures. This analysis came out, for instance, under structural adjustment programs in the 80s and 90s. And today we see similar critiques in response to the financial crisis. So just to give you a sense of what we're talking about, in Africa, for instance, public expenditures fallen from 9% of GDP in 1980 to 6% in 2005, despite rapid urbanization, rapid population growth. So what we're seeing is that the current levels still remain lower than 1980 in terms of public expenditure. And this is taken from a report by UN Women written by Stephanie Sakino, titled Financing for Gender Equality. And that was launched this year that you can access on their website. Another report showed that a survey of 56 developing countries shows that 2/3 were cutting budget allocations in 2010 to sectors that have significant effects on gender equality, including education, health, social protection, subsidies on food, fuel, and basic items. So we're saying that these cuts in public services are still very much present with us today. And even in countries in the global south who we may not think are directly impacted by the financial crisis, or perhaps not to the same extent as some countries in the north are. So these are economic policies that come about by an economic model that supports cuts in public services, that supports the deregulation of labor policies, and the lack of regulation to protect the environment that lead to increasing levels of unpaid care work. So for instance, a deregulation of labor policies has meant that women are expected to engage not only in paid work at very low wages over long hours, but they don't necessarily get these kinds of working arrangements are not conducive to providing care, not just for women, but men as well. So I'm going to, I think it's important to frame this discussion around human rights, but also draw the link between human rights and economic policies and how that overall has an impact on women's rights. I'm going to stop here and hand it over to Thalia to take us through the rest.
Hi, this is Thalia again. Thank you very much, Rachel. Unpaid care is invisible, it's unequal, it's treated as a cost-free alternative, it has inadequate support and investment. Many people are convinced that care provision is problematic, but there's a big question about where we start to make change. It's very complex, the way that care is organized in society now. It's based on long-standing patterns and power relations and beliefs and rules and policies, economic policies like Rachel was mentioning, culture and politics. So where do you start? What we found is that it's very important to be able to communicate in a simple way what we're trying to do. What are our strategies for change and what are the policy asks. And some years ago, Diane Elson proposed a powerful framework of 3 R's, which you see here, and we've added a 4th R. The first is that we want care to be recognized and care work. The second is that we want to not reduce care, but reduce what is difficult and inefficient and arduous drudgery about it. We want to redistribute care between women and men, and the responsibility of care between families to states and employers, especially poor families, and that carers should be representing themselves in decisions and policy making. So many of us work for more women to be represented, but especially women who do significant caring, and that this is a precondition for achieving women's empowerment. Next slide, please. So who are we asking to make these changes? The Care Diamond that was proposed by Cheryl Rizavi shows that each society divides up responsibility for providing care. Some is provided by households through the unpaid work of women and men, in the market through paid workers and cleaning businesses and employers' benefits, by NGOs and community and religious groups, and by the state, which pays subsidies or employs care professionals, health and education, and elderly care, and also by regulating what business is required to provide in terms of benefits or the costs of care. So our claims for redistribution from women to men and also from families to states and employers and NGOs, and our claims for reducing the drudgery of care often happens when state and business and NGOs are providing the infrastructure and services that support households to do unpaid care. Next slide, please. What are some of the examples of what we're talking about? Over the decades, advocates have wanted to recognize care by convincing many governments to do national time use surveys, including care work. So there are extensive time use studies and evidence that exist around these national surveys. They're not always very well known and need to be better known and used in policy making. In terms of recognizing care as a significant part of life and a part of the economy. And as we'll explain in a moment, there are a number of development organizations that are also documenting time use in less rigorous and expensive ways than the national surveys. Other efforts include school curriculums and radio spots, theater, digital communications, and others. Examples of reducing the drudgery and isolation of care work include water and electricity systems, grain mills, HIV and AIDS home care, washing machines, etc. And on redistribution, there are wonderful organizations, and I'm forgetting the name right at the moment, that are organizing and teaching young men and fathers to take pride in housework and child care and elder care. There's also advocacy with states, as we've heard with Rachel's examples, claims in terms of labor rights for employers to provide employment benefits. And with both of these, especially highlighting how poor women have less support for care work and stay poor because they do so much care work. And the fourth on representation, an example I thought of was the international networks of domestic workers and of unpaid carers that we heard about in the e-discussion that have begun to bring the voice of carers into policy making. Next slide. So this is a reminder that we would like your comments and questions to be discussed in the last section. We've given some definitions and framework and research to talk about the situation on care, especially women's unpaid care, and we'd like to know what you're thinking. As a pause before we go on for more presentations, we're going to have 2 polls. Next slide, please. One poll is, why is care invisible in your context? We'd like to know, in your organization, your community, the sector you work in, or in your culture, what are the reasons that come up, the barriers, the challenges, what myths and ideas do we need to address? Because this kind of exercise is also helpful with groups, because in every context, in order to make change, it's important to think about the challenges that we're up against. So as you are selecting your top one, we'd also like to say that there are many other reasons that people have told us why care is invisible in your context, and there's you could chat in as well. It would be great to have that type of information from all of us. And since I have the mic, I'll say a couple other things that people have said to me. That care is invisible because it's not considered skill, because care, paid and unpaid, is usually done by working class and ethnic minorities, and therefore not considered important in society. The whole economic model is based on being self-interested rather than altruism, and care goes against that. There are many, many reasons why care is invisible. Do we have any results? Could one of the organizers tell us about the results?
Should I go?
Yes, we have the highest the highest response rate was B. 30%. Care is something women do. It's natural and normal. The second one is 26%. Care isn't considered work. On third place, we have 22%. It happens in the private sphere. And then we have 19%. It's too hard to change and not easy to measure. And the last one is 4%. It is not clear what the alternatives are. What can we do?
Okay, let's go on to the second poll.
And thanks to everyone who voted.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. The second poll, which we'll see in a second, next slide, yep, is looking at entry points. In many contexts, a big challenge is also to choose what the entry point is. What's the first step that would help you getting others to talk about care? Is it to recognize care through publicizing the national time use surveys or local stories of carers? Do you need to recognize it? Is it to be very practical, to just get the water systems working, a laundry, child care, to reduce the time and difficulty of care tasks? The third is it critical to highlight gender inequality to get men to do more? Is that the first step, the most effective strategy? Or instead, the fourth one, for men and women to work together to advocate with states or employers, not highlighting gender inequality at first, but the redistribution from families to the state? Or fifth, is it to get carers into public decision-making roles, which then might help change policies later on? So please take the poll as well, and we'll then see what people say. Could we have the results now?
Yes.
Okay, so as you see in the pink at the top, recognizing feels to most participants that it is the first step or the most effective strategy, and followed by a pretty close tie between reduction, redistribution, and representation. But again, the idea is to think through this pretty clearly. Okay, on to the next slide. Okay, so in this second section, we're exploring some examples of strategies. In Oxfam's approach, in effect, our answers to these polls are that we need to recognize care and reduce it, and we need to promote new beliefs that care is work, that it may be in the private sphere, but it has a lot of social consequences. We thought that it needed context-specific evidence that care is heavy and unequal for women here. It's a significant issue here, not just in some national survey, that it is relevant to our food security or enterprise or governance programs, showing the links between care work and limitations on women's participation and leadership, that the analysis that we do needs to be fast and inexpensive and easy to use by non-experts to show us that something should be done and can be done, and it's inspiring and getting people to work together. Next slide, please. So we've developed a rapid care analysis participatory methodology, which is only 1 or 2 days, 6 to 10 hours of work with 12 to 20 women and men. It's been done in a dozen countries, and it has, through these 4 focus group discussions, gotten various community-based organizations, women's organizations, and development practitioners thinking about care. The first focus group discussion, or the first step, is to get people to understand that we all care, that this is a societal issue, a social good. The second point is to get some numbers. We have found that numbers is important, that if you, in this case, we use within 2 hours a very rapid process to get individuals to think what they did in paid and unpaid work yesterday, and then a discussion to bring up estimates about what women do in this context on average and what men do over a week. and I'll show you an example in a minute. What we found is that even this very rapid way of coming up with some data is good enough, and if the group of 20 people agree, it gives enough legitimacy to be able to do the influencing and advocacy to say this is significant and relevant. The third step is to come up with what is the problem about the way care is organized in our context by gender and age, also by looking at policies, as Rachel was saying, and as Deepta was saying about early childhood or social protection programs. It could be migration, it could be a disaster, a political conflict. What is changing the way that we do care, and therefore what are the top most problematic activities for women, which often end up being water, fuel, cooking, and childcare. And then in order to not leave it as a problem, to say what are our definitions of what we should change and could change. So on to the next slide, please. So the idea is that there is a community-defined way of saying this is the problem. This is from the Char region in northern Bangladesh, which came up with women doing about 106 hours a week of paid and unpaid work, and men 71. And yes, men did more paid work, about 50-some, and women about 21. But then unpaid care work, sorry, the second to last should say other unpaid work like subsistence agriculture. That means that women have a huge overload on their time. And this was good enough to be able to get people thinking we need to do something. On to the next slide. So in many of these different countries, what was discussed was these are the top issues that we want to do in our community to address the problematic aspects of providing care. Water pumps, childcare services, a bus service to take children to and from school in Sri Lanka, sanitation services, public parks. So there were a number of ideas that these different groups came up with, and then are moving into advocacy. Next slide, please. So I'll say very quickly that we found that there are very popular ways to be able to get people to recognize what they live in their lives anyway. This AFM, Articulación Feminista Mercosur, is a funded partner of Oxfam and put together viral emails about migrant domestic workers' rights in South America and also to Spain and Europe. But it also helped people to understand that all of this was work and that we should recognize the economic contribution of care work. And it showed a bit in the next viral email that I'll show you about the international care chain. So let's go on to the next slide. So this one is a wealthy woman saying, I'm going to work, and then a domestic worker saying, I'm going to work, I'll be back in a few years. And showing the millions of women that are involved in these international care chains and the issues of the women who are left behind caring for these women. So this is just one example of popular communications, and I'm going to pass it over now to Rachel to continue.
Great, thank you, Thalia. I'm going to talk a little about how we start talking about advocacy and what are the steps that we need to take to make care more visible in our context. And Thalia's already introduced this idea through the rapid care analysis, which gives us some really good evidence to start taking to local community leaders, but also to national governments. So what I want to introduce right now is a framework around naming, framing, claiming, and programming, which was developed by Rosalind Eben at IDS, and you can find a link to it at the bottom of this slide if you want to read over it. It's a short policy briefing of about 4 pages that goes into the steps that are important for anyone that's working to make care visible. The first is around naming, which is about putting care and making it visible in policy discussions. And as Deepta was saying, and as the review showed of the social protection and early child care policies, care isn't visible. It's not spoken about, even though we all know that it happens. It happens in our day-to-day lives, and we may actually do care work ourselves. It's not visible when there are policy discussions, when within the development sector, when we're talking about things like access to water, we often don't necessarily talk about women's different needs for water than men, and not just being agricultural, but also being to support them for their unpaid care work. So it's about naming care and making it visible in existing policy discussions. The other issue is around framing, and I think there's a lot of scope for discussion and debate here. How do we want to frame unpaid care work? The UN Special Rapporteur's report on unpaid care framed it as a human right, framed unpaid care work as leading to human rights violations when it's unequally shared. We have, in this presentation, we've used several terms. We've used women's rights, we've used well-being, inequality, poverty. We've talked about the contribution of care to social development as a social good. There are some people that want to talk about care as a burden, so the unequal responsibility for care can be seen as a burden. There are others who challenge that and say if we talk about care as a burden, then we're giving it a negative connotation, and how do we also present a positive image of care? So these are the kinds of issues that I know that Thalia, Deepta, and I grapple with quite a bit in terms of how do we frame care in the different policy debates that we engage in. The third criteria is around claiming, and claiming is around, in this case, is defined quite succinctly as demand for government action. And this is because the agenda, the naming, framing, claiming, and programming agenda that Rosalind points out here is very much about changing policies. And to change policies, we need to get government action. And we've been referring to this throughout the presentation. The last part is around programming. And that's thinking about how we design and implement programs that support more equitable distribution of care responsibilities. That's not just about government programs. It can also be about NGO programs. For instance, I know that in our own organization, we need to be mindful of when we hold community discussions, when we hold group meetings, if we want women to attend because of the constraints on women's time. So just to quickly give you an example, I'm just going to go to the next slide, which is going to talk a little bit about what we've been doing at ActionAid. So like Oxfam, we've done a slightly longer study around participatory research and using time diaries that women themselves filled out in their groups. And that was a way to raise awareness within women's groups to get the discussion going around care. We built up the capacity of women and their groups and organizations to value unpaid care work, to start framing it both as something that is valuable and something that is onerous and difficult for them to do, and that leads to human rights violations. So we were very clear in framing it both from a positive perspective, but also bringing in the inequality that's linked to it and human rights. And that's been our framing for this discussion so far. We then developed a comparative participatory research with men who then also filled out time diaries and presented that at community discussions. And that was really a way of naming and framing unpaid care work to a broader audience, not just to the women in the group, but also to the men that were involved in the project and within the communities. And then we worked with the women to develop this whole idea around claiming, so identifying the priorities that they want to see. So in rural Kenya, some of the women talked about wanting an early child care center that had been promised to them by government in the previous elections but had never been built. In Nepal, women talked about the need for a water tank and were involved in getting funding from local government to build the water tank. So all of these are different examples of claiming. And what we've also done is we've used this research that's very much at the community level to take it up to a national level. So we've produced a report which you can have a link to. We've developed an infographic, and we've started working at the national level in 4 countries, in Nepal, Nigeria, Uganda, and Kenya, to build alliances and coalitions to take this work forward. So I'm going to leave it there. If you want to find out more, you can look at the report, and you can also get in touch with me directly afterwards. So I'm going to hand it over to Deepta.
Great, thank you very much, Rachel and Thalia. That was so you've heard about how all of our different organizations are using a mix of research and advocacy to link both the community level work to popular communications and to policymakers at the national level. What we did at IDS was also develop an animation on unpaid care work, linking women and girls empowerment with human rights. And really trying to get across the message that although care is so important for everybody, including people who are rich or poor, but it's very unrecognized and undervalued by policymakers, and that there is a need for policy change that recognizes the role of women and girls in the provision of unpaid care work, but not just recognizes, but actually has very practical suggestions of how to reduce the drudgery of unpaid care, and also how the goal of redistribution, both from women to men and also from families to the communities in the state, can be done. So in terms of, I'm going to show you this video in a minute, and we really developed this video in order for policymakers to be able to get a quick overview of these issues, and of course, please do feel free to share this video and use it in your advocacy. This is an open access resource, and if anybody has any questions or comments about that, they could be getting back in touch with me as well. So Anna, could we play the video? Thanks.
We say that we include the
Great, thank you. And apologies for I think the sound didn't work for everybody, but we leave it at that, and the link is there, so if anybody would want to watch it, they can go back onto the YouTube link and see the animation again. And I'll pass it back on to Anna now.
Yes, thank you so much, and apologies for the sound. I think it's quite powerful in images, but as you said, participant can watch it with the sound afterwards. So thank you so much for excellent presentation. It was very, very interesting. And we have about 6 questions and comments in the comment box, and we have 3 hands raised. But we will start with I'm going to read the comments and questions in the comment box first. And then we can see if the ones with the hand raised still would like to say something, because I think there is some overlap. The first question, can you scroll up? There are actually more questions coming in. The first question is Marianne Gel's question. No, that's not the one. Any other measures considered to advocate for vigorous sociocultural changes in their approach to care work and the treatment of care workers? Is the first comment and question. The second one comes from Gail Ferrand. I'm wondering to what extent the unequal unpaid care work burden is related to social institutions and norms. The next one comes from Imogen Davis. There is not enough incentives to change the situation as it supports the status quo. Gail has another comment. If we are able to measure the contribution of unpaid care, it could raise awareness about its importance for our economies and well-being. Would you like me to continue reading? I think they're all kind of interlinked, so I could continue reading some of the other comments, since we also kind of run a little bit towards the end of the webinar.
Anna, could you maybe give us if there are any other questions that you'd like us to address?
Yes, so I'll go down the list of comments that have come in. Care also reduces women's time to engage in farming activities and reduces their self-confidence. Azumi is sharing from Ghana, by adopting the care diamond and starting from household level, they had meetings with women's groups where these women led community sensitization, and major changes have happened in that community in Ghana, where men and boys not only recognize care work but also support it and reduce it. We also have from Connie, in the IDEA study, you looked at two policies and if they were considered care responsibilities. Both were somewhat in the social field where one would expect care work to appear. Was there any mention of care work in economic policies? Did care work come up there as well? If it's invisible already in social policies, I wonder how it could feature in economic ones. There is a few more comments. Should I continue? Or would you like to take this first?
I can respond quickly to the specific question on the IDEA study, if you want.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, basically, yes. Thank you. And that was precisely what we found. And in fact, we had chosen the social policy sectors because there was because we were expecting that care would be visible in at least the social policies, and for us it was quite stark and quite startling to actually say that there isn't any recognition of care within those social policies. We have not looked at economic policies, but we do share the concern that if this doesn't appear in social policies, it's probably not going to appear in economic policies either.
Good. There is a question from Ruth. She's saying a positive point is that the civil society is organizing themselves in communities, sharing works independent of syndicates. Some are added in projects, showing very good results to learn how to lead with the challenges. She's wondering if the human rights violations happens all over the world or just in Latin America, or I think it was also, you made a reference in your presentation to Sub-Saharan Africa. Radha from Nepal is also asking a question, how can we recognize unpaid care work at the local and national level? I really struggle to realize this in rural areas in Nepal. And Claudia finally is asking, what are the example of strategies that have been successful at redistributing work between women and men in the household? And how do you change deep-rooted cultural norms that protect men from doing care work?
I can respond to the question from Nepal. One of the countries that we did this study in and also have started national advocacy in is Nepal. And in 2011, we did a review with 400 women on about 100 men in Nepal in four different communities to look at how much time they spend on unpaid care work. And the information that came out of that really helped to change, well, at least informed community discussions. And of course some men resisted and said that this was women's role and that they would make no contribution to this. Others said that, others may have started, taking care of their children, but there was definitely not a sharing of roles between women and men after the review and also after the community discussions. But what did happen was that women were able to claim the VDC budget, the Village Development Committee budget, to for investments that would help to reduce their unpaid care work. And most of that was around infrastructure. And I think that in itself is a first step. So it might be that the first step isn't about changing men's attitudes. The first step might be women organizing and getting some public services. And that in itself can help to strengthens women's mobilization and their own conscientization about why care is important and that it is a valuable contribution. And that can therefore lead to social change later on. But I don't think we should set for ourselves as an objective that we want to share work between women and men immediately, or we expect to see that change immediately. I think that will really depend, and even in the communities where we work, some men have changed, but then men only tend to do the work that they enjoy doing. They get to choose which unpaid care work they do. So for instance, men will take more care of their children, but they may not necessarily clean the dishes or do housework. Or take care of a crying baby in the middle of the night. So there are limitations, but I think what we're trying to push at ActionAid is really that the key point here is that women organize and that we also show the responsibility of the state to take this into consideration, because the state can also be a real driver for social and cultural change. And if the state can support these kinds of policies and help more women to possibly engage in paid work if they choose to, in a way that at the same time reduces their unpaid care work or alleviates their unpaid care work, then we can see changes in dynamics and changes in relations. I'll leave it there in case others have something to add.
Great. We are getting a lot of comments here, so I don't know if I should continue, raise some of the questions, or somebody else has something to add at this point.
This is Thalia. I'll add just a little bit, which is that there were several questions from Gail and Claudia about changing norms, and also the question about incentives to change the status quo. Well, there is a lot of echo. I think that one of the biggest norms that we have to address is that it is normal and natural the way things are, and that it is not problematic. So one of the strategies is to create the evidence or the discussions to show that it is problematic, and that is going to be very context specific. So if in one's own community there is a real community agreement that there should be more economic development and income generation and enterprises, or better care of adults with chronic illness, or better care of children, or whatever, showing that the way things are is problematic leads to an incentive to change. So the incentive can be very personal at an individual level, husbands and wives or partners, or at a political or an economic level, and that at the same time, that's the sort of voluntary route of everybody trying to move change. And then there's also the political power route that say that women must organize to claim from their states and from employers their human rights. So the framing of the UN Special Rapporteur's report is critical, because it says this is problematic at a very high level, and we need to do something about it, and that states are just as bound to have equal distribution of responsibility for care work as they are bound to not torture prisoners or allow crime or something like that. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much. There is, I'm just going to run through very, very quickly since we are running over time. But there's one question from Felicity. How do you distinguish between unpaid farm work and unpaid care work? What are the boundaries and rules for defining what goes into what category? We also have Hamid Abdallah, who is asking if there's any global programs in Sudan where women are suffering from this issue, and if there is anything more broader being developed for Africa in general.
Okay, I'm happy to take on the question around how to define unpaid care work. Unpaid care work relates to all the work that's done within the household and also within the community that's unpaid and goes towards the direct care of people. And this definition came around by the UN itself, actually, when they were setting standards for how countries would collect their gross domestic product, so GDP. GDP calculations do not include unpaid care work. And in essence, they include only activities that are either paid work. So for instance, the work of domestic workers should be included in GDP in theory, though it's very hard to collect that information. GDP also includes information around unpaid work, so subsistence agriculture. But again, that's an estimate. In countries that are still very agricultural dependent, have a high agricultural dependence, and they're mostly smallholder farmers, there's usually an estimate in those countries as to how much subsistence agriculture contributes to the national GDP. But though there are many ways of measuring unpaid care work and calculating the total amount, which has been done by feminist economists and national bureaus of statistics, it's not technically included in GDP. And the main way of doing that, the main way of collecting unpaid care work data is through national time use surveys. But then those are held in satellite accounts which are separate to the GDP and therefore often ignored. So I hope that helps to give you a distinction. The activities that are done in the home, if I understood you correctly, are very much part of unpaid care work, but are not included in national statistics.
Thank you so much. And I can just respond very briefly on the point of Sudan, that everything that UN Women is doing in Africa relates to some extent or another to unpaid care work. That's part of our programming in Africa and also including in Sudan. That's something that we always have on our minds. So there are activities going on in Sudan on recognizing, reducing, and redistributing unpaid care work. We have one hand raised, and it's an Oxfam colleague, I believe, in Sri Lanka. So we are unmuting you, and you're welcome to
Sinatambo?
Sinatambu.
Do you have a question?
Do you have a question or comment? Sina? No, it doesn't seem to work. So I believe we have come to the end. Do the experts have anything, final comments before we close for today?
No, I would just like to thank you, Anna, and the team at UN Women for hosting this discussion. I hope that it's been valuable for the people that have participated as well, and that we get other chances to interact. So please do email us and get in touch if you have any unanswered questions, because I know we weren't able to go through all of them.
Yes, definitely. And the open questions and discussions in the knowledge circles is a good place for any participant to raise some of these issues, and we can connect you if there are any questions that would require your responses. In terms of RADA has raised the issue of the rapid care analysis. All of the documentation that we have talked about, and I think almost all, is available on the Knowledge Gateway. And after this webinar, we will also share the slides and the links to the various other resources that are not currently available. But the Oxfam and ActionAid reports that were referred to, as well as the Special Rapporteur's report, is all available on the Knowledge Gateway.
Thank you very much, Anna. This is Thalia, and I want to say that, yes, I really welcome how much work UN Women has been putting into expanding the discussions on these issues. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, and thank you. And we do hope that we can continue this. Please do feel free to email your comments and suggestions and thoughts.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar, and we look forward to engaging with you on other and similar topics in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Did you mute us?